Marcus, son of Marcus, born in Athens around 139 BC, died around 52 BC, was one of the pupils of Panaetius, the leading Stoic philosopher of his day. In fact, he is referred to as the younger Marcus, probably to distinguish him from his father, who was also called Marcus, but who was known as Marcus the Elder. And even less have we heard about his teacher, Panaetius. The first was the study of nature, which I think means natural philosophy, what we would call science today. It was there that he met Panaetius, the head of the Stoa, the leader of the Stoics. He applied himself to all branches of philosophy, and, indeed, of literature generally. He wrote a great deal himself. He did not, however, publish his work, but circulated his manuscripts among his friends, requesting their criticisms and suggestions for improvement. He was preeminent in point of ability and reputation. The Stoics at Athens looked to him as their leader and the other philosophers as their superior. He lived to an advanced age and died during the absence of the Roman general Lucullus. Lucullus wished to bring him back to Rome with honor, but Panaetius would not leave Athens, saying that he wished to remain where Socrates had lived and died. So even though he spent most of his life in Rome, Panaetius loved Athens. And even though he was Roman by birth, he always felt Greek in his heart. Just before his death, he visited the grave of Socrates. And when the Athenians wanted to erect a monument over the philosopher's remains, it was Panaetius who gave the lead by subscription. Nor did he decline to make extracts from and to translate into Greek works of other philosophers. If you want to learn more about Stoicism, check out our Stoic Quotes channel, where we post daily quotes and mini episodes. You can follow the link in the description. Also, please remember to vote for the best teacher in the comments. Thank you for watching. Nor did he think that any department of knowledge was foreign to his purpose. He made himself master of the whole circle of the mathematical sciences. He inquired diligently into the subject matter of physics, and was not satisfied with the progress which the Stoics had made in those matters. He examined the questions relating to the state and duties of man, and investigated thoroughly the whole field of morals. I do not know whether he wrote anything on poetry. If he did, it must have been very late in life. But certainly he had the highest appreciation of poetic excellence, and was so far from despising poetry as some philosophers do, that he treated it as a liberal accomplishment. So Marcus must have gone to Athens to study under Panaetius. But what was he like? Well, Plutarch describes him as follows. His grandfather had been a leading Stoic philosopher, and it was he who started the school in Athens where Panaetius and Marcus later taught. Pergosa was a center of culture and learning, and the house of the ancestors of Panaetius contained many ancient and precious books. When Perseus was sacked by the Romans, only Panaetius' family escaped with their lives. So they lost everything. But when Athenian learned of their plight, he invited Panaetius to live in his home and study in his library. After the death of Athenian, Panaetius took over the school and became the most famous Stoic of his day. Though his father had been a Stoic, his mother's family was Roman. So it was through Panaetius that Stoicism really took root in Rome. In fact, we can thank his mother's side of the family for this. Her brother was married to the sister of two famous Roman brothers, the historian Livy and the poet Virgil. Anyway, the mother of Panaetius, thinking that her son was too influenced by the Greeks and their culture, asked him to move to Rome and teach there. So this is how Marcus ended up in Rome studying under the great teacher. Panaetius was a man of a middle type, spare and wiry in frame, his face not so regular or handsome as to attract the eye, but rather such as would escape one's notice. Yet his appearance had a certain homely sort of comeliness. His eyes were clear and sparkling, and his countenance sober and serious. Now, though he did not use to declaim, as others did, or discourse warmly and fluently, he was modest and staid in his manner, and whatever he said was briefly and pithily spoken. In discussing subjects, he was a master of bringing every question into clear light. He had also the reputation of being able to discuss any subject whatever. He was ready for everything, and no one could throw him off his balance or surprise him by any unexpected question. He was very exact and rigid in the examination of every subject. And it was his practice to demand of those who disputed against the Stoics, "What is your proof?" For he thought that a man ought to be prepared not only to make assertions, but to examine and prove them also. Nor did he think that mere talk and plausible assertion were sufficient, but required strict accuracy, that arguments should be tightly reasoned, exactly defined and closely examined, and that no obscurity or ambiguity should escape him. Then there was the study of the human soul and emotions, psychology, you could say. And third, the study of duties and obligations, ethics and politics. And in these three areas, Marcus helped Cicero more than anyone else. But Cicero wasn't his only famous student. Plutarch tells us that he also tutored the young Mark Antony. Another one of his students was Gaius Fannius Cyrus, who became famous for a work he wrote called De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, on the ends of good and evil. There is a letter from Cicero to Atticus in which he mentions having seen another pupil of Marcus, Titus Pomponius Atticus. And this, too, must have been in Rome, for Cicero writes, "I was very glad to see him, for I had not seen him since he left his teacher." So it seems that Marcus had a school in Rome where he taught these men and where he lived for a good part of his life. But as I said, we do not know a lot about him. Who was Panatius? What kind of man was he? What was he like? This is the subject of this episode. We will look at what we know about him from the life of another famous Stoic, and then we will move on to Panatius. But let's start with a quote from Cicero about Marcus, because he gives us some insight into how he taught. He devoted his whole life to philosophy. His own interests he subordinated to those of his pupils. To the end of his life, he continued to teach, expound and hand down the doctrines of his order. It was his custom to read over his lectures beforehand and to repeat them as if he were reading them for the first time. For he said that speaking was an imperfect substitute for writing, and writing an imperfect substitute for speaking, and that the highest aim of a teacher should be to make himself unnecessary. That is a beautiful way to sum up Marcus's legacy, to make himself unnecessary. That is the greatest gift a teacher can hope to give his students, to help them so much that they no longer need him. He was, according to Diogenes Laertius, the first to introduce the Stoics to the Greek East. He traveled all over Asia Minor, Greece and Italy, spreading the word of Stoicism and founding schools in many cities. He was so well known that Pliny the Younger, writing to his friend Lucilius, says, "Do you know that there is a school of philosophy in Rome founded by the Stoics? It is taught by a certain Marcus, a man of distinguished family and relationship to us, for he is the nephew of the elder Marcus." So this Marcus, the founder of the school in Rome, was the brother of Marcus Philus, who was the uncle of the great emperor Marcus Aurelius. Through Marcus Aurelius, Stoicism would eventually become the official philosophy of Rome. And thus it is fair to say that the Roman Empire owed its debt to this Marcus, the nephew of Marcus the Elder. Yet apart from Pliny's letter, we know little about him except through the writings of his pupil, the great Roman philosopher Cicero. Cicero tells us that Marcus had three main areas where he focused his teachings. We do know that when Cicero went to Athens in 78 BC, he visited the schools of philosophy there and discussed philosophy with the leaders. Cicero has something similar to say about Panatius. As for Panatius, I doubt if anyone of my own time could equal him in point of industry. Now, Panatius was born in Athens, but his parents were from a place called Pergusa in Sicily. Cicero said of him, "I am not exaggerating when I say that he was the instructor and tutor of almost all the Roman youth of distinguished family." So that is the story of Marcus and Panatius, the two Athenian Stoics who are most connected to Rome.